It has started, so things become serious. Good. So I'd like to welcome you officially to our second Homines talk in this year. Our talks, it's just a series of conversations about political traumatization and everything that got to do with it. And our last talk took place a few weeks ago. There we spoke about possibilities to psychosocially support refugee girls. And on that conversation, it turned out that creative ways of coping are especially important for the girls, since they need to express their difficult experiences and maybe also transform them. And so we thought it might be a good idea to focus especially on this issue of art therapy or of creative ways of coping. And this is why we meet today on this Skype conversation. I'd like to welcome our first guest is Carolyn Krüger, who I mentioned you first because you had participated in the last talk, and together we had this idea of a continuation, and I'm glad to have you here. Carolyn is an art psychotherapist, native German, but you have lived and worked in quite a few countries in the world, and so have our experience with many different settings and cultures and clients, also with refugees, and so I'm glad to have you in this talk today, where we focus on creative ways of coping with trauma. Our second guest and her colleague is Nehama Grenimann Bauch, an art therapist. Hello.
Hi.
An art therapist from Israel, originally from Jerusalem even. I had the privilege to spend half a year of my lifetime in Jerusalem, so I really get sentimental when I hear that somebody is a real Jerusalemite. Do you say so?
Yeah, born and bred, yeah.
Born and bred. Okay. So Nehama is an art therapist too. Has also worked and lived in different countries. I think especially with children, if I'm right. And so we're curious to hear about creative ways of coping. And at the end of our conversation, I think we're going to contrast this a little bit with narrative ways of coping, because this is what we are doing here at Homines predominantly. And so let's see where the commonalities are and where the differences are.
Sure.
Nehama.
Yes.
When I prepared for this talk, I listened to a podcast that Carolyn did with you last year, and it turned out that there is an autobiographical background, which is very interesting and also touching in a way. And it's kind of a continuation to a conversation that we had in November last year with Dr. Martin Auerbach, who is the director of Amcha Israel, an organization that provides psychosocial help for Holocaust survivors and the second generation. And in your ancestry, as I've learned, there's also a background of Nazi persecution. And your grandparents, I think, had to flee from Germany. And now you're located here in Germany, in Berlin. and work with refugees. So I think this is something, if you wish, maybe you want to say something about this. I found it interesting what you said in the podcast, so maybe you can relate to this.
Sure. I can give a short background about it, and then after we give our presentation, we can gladly discuss it further. I am, yeah. Should I give a small explanation about that, or
Well, as you like. Yeah, just give a.
Yeah. I mean, I'm from Jerusalem, born in Jerusalem, but my grandfather was born in Berlin. All four grandparents came from Europe, not all from Germany. One from Germany, one from Vienna, and two from Eastern Europe, Poland and White Russia. And they were all refugees, but some were not Holocaust survivors. Two escaped in the 30s. And to endure the Holocaust. That's the short of it, so to speak. So I'm third generation. Yes.
You're third generation. And maybe you could say one or two sentences what it is like to live and to work in Berlin and work with refugees yourself now as a third generation refugee, as it were.
I mean, yeah, I guess I'm a third generation, two refugees. I'm an immigrant myself, but don't feel. Yeah, my grandparents, when I was born, were settled, so we didn't have that experience. But it's a complicated question. I mean, I think maybe I can touch on it, and then if we want to go into it deeper, we shouldn't go too deeply into it right now, so that we can talk about art therapy and trauma. But yeah, I married to a German who I met in Jerusalem, and I've been living in Berlin for 5.5 years now, but we've been married for almost 11 years and together for 13. So my connection to Germany has been ongoing. There are a lot of years to talk about, so to speak. And I have children who have a mixed identity, if you want to define it that way. So yeah, we can discuss it further later on. It has a lot of implications, which I usually, as I said in the podcast, I keep them out of my work, although I also hold the awareness that they do influence, they inevitably influence my worldview and what I see in refugees. But I also try to remind myself that it's my family story, and that doesn't necessarily imply that's their experiences.
I see. Yeah, that's what you said in the podcast, that it's important to keep the balance, not to project your biographical background too much on others, and at the same time being aware of who you are or who one is, to put it in general terms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Carolyn, could you maybe say something about you, just for a short personal introduction?
I think most about me you already said. I did study art psychotherapy in England and stayed there during that time as well. And I have always been very interested in working in relation to socio-political contexts, also in different countries. Spent some time of my life in Ghana and a lot of time in Nepal, where a lot of the creating link work also took place, and in other countries too, like South Africa. I came back to Germany in 2015, which was a quite important time for Germany, considering the influx of people seeking asylum at the time. And then I was basically already, right into that work of working with displaced populations. And I've always had a really great interest in working with cultural diversity and issues of social injustice and issues related to that.
Okay. Thanks for that. Well, I forgot to say an important point about you, that you both belong to Creating Links, which is an organization, it's an association of art therapists. So that's the background of the both of you. And I'm really curious now to hear and to watch the presentation you are kind enough to give us about creating links and what your approach is and how art therapy can be applied to traumatized and displaced persons.
Yeah, we'll do our best. So I'll share my screen, and I will probably not see you anymore if I remember correctly from last time. So please just let me know, switch on your camera or whatever if you have questions in between, and I'll stop and let you speak. And so you should all see the presentation now. Oh, but we are like. We're not where we were supposed to be.
There you are.
We're supposed to be. Yeah, so as you already said, it's more like a non-profit project, Creating Links. And we came together as art therapists from different nations, different countries, to promote the creative work with displacement, trauma, and difference. I just put up a small schedule about today. So we just wanted to give you a very brief background about Creating Links, and since this is where we both work, and then just speak about what art therapy is, how we see art in the context of cultural diversity, and how creative methods can be used in the work with trauma and displacement, including a couple of examples how we use them in our work. So just once again, Gwen, who's also here in the talk, and Nehama and I, we belong to a small collective of art psychotherapists from different nations. We also have a colleague in Indonesia and in the UK, and as Nehama said, she's from Israel. We also believe in efficacy of multicultural work, not only amongst ourselves, but also multidisciplinary work with colleagues from other professional backgrounds, like social backgrounds, teaching backgrounds, psychology backgrounds. And we try to collaborate with as many different professionals from different countries as possible in our work. We did found Creating Links in 2015 when two things happened. The influx of people seeking asylum in Europe, as I already mentioned, but also the earthquakes in Nepal. And that's what really encouraged us to start this little project, which is very much about psychoeducation and skills sharing. So, for example, after the earthquakes in Nepal, we were working with teachers and other professionals working with children, sharing knowledge about trauma and how the children can be worked with creatively. And that turned into working a lot with psychology students in Nepal. So it's very much about supporting other professionals to work creatively with displaced and traumatized children and families. And by supporting communities, we really hope that we can create ripple effects and positive social changes for future generations, because the children will hopefully grow into more socially aware adults as well. As I already mentioned, we chose to work in this way because, like everyone else, we saw that there's a rising number of displaced populations and also globalization, and there's more migration in the world, and due to some other historical contexts, we have more diverse communities than ever before, which does, we believe, mean also an increased need for intercultural competencies and for social awareness for issues related to injustice and other difficulties. Yeah, and we really do hope that community-based approaches that consider also non-Western concepts and resources for well-being, so not only the perspective of Western mental health on other cultures as it often comes in, will also create more opportunities for empowerment and social change. So this was just really briefly to give you a background of like what we believe in and how we work. And then we thought it might be best to really start at the bottom of things and talk about what art therapy is, because when we have conversations about it, one could say that art therapy probably has as many different approaches as other psychotherapy professions have. And I think for us, at least within our little collective in Creating Links, most of us were trained in the UK. But also when we had conversations with Nehama, who's obviously trained in Israel, and we saw that there's quite a similar thinking around art therapy. In the UK, I would say mainly the main form of art therapy is psychodynamic, so working with transferences, but there's also, like in any other country, different approaches. We chose a little statement that I shortened from the British Association of Art Therapists, because I think we all liked it, when it comes to explaining art therapy, which says it's a form of psychotherapy that uses art as its primary mode of expression and communication. And within this context, art is a medium that can address emotional issues that might be confusing or distressing for the person who experiences them. And art therapists really work with a variety of people, age groups, difficulties, diagnoses, disabilities, all kinds of emotional, behavioral and mental health problems, and also learning disabilities, etc., can be worked with art therapy. Something that is often communicated is that it's not just a recreational activity or an art lesson, because that's where a lot of the confusion lies when you have conversations with people. But sessions like making art can obviously still be enjoyable, although it might not always be in every session. And because I think most people have a certain relationship to art, through school, because we are often taught that things have to look nice, that aesthetics count when it comes to art. We usually say that you don't need to have a talent or previous experience or any expertise in art or craft in that sense, because it's really more about the process of making art and what you express with it, rather than that it really looks good in the end. So we included a little bit how we work as art therapists.
May I ask a question?
Mm-hmm. I can't hear you anymore. You?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sometimes it's interrupted. The connection sometimes is not ideal.
Mm-hmm.
From time to time. I wanted to ask a question as to the aim of art therapy. You say it's something else and something more, maybe, or something different in any case, than just enjoy the recreational aspect of art and of producing art. So, and you said that it's there to process something or to well, to link the art, the process of producing art to your biography. Could you say something on how these two aspects of come together? So where's the link between the biography, the biographical work, and the focus on symptoms or the reduction of symptoms and the process of producing art? Is it about reducing symptoms mainly, or is it about like a concept of personal growth?
I would say both. I wouldn't be, and Nehama and Gwen will also art therapists, who can please contribute at any point. So I think art therapy also, the art making process takes place within a relationship with a therapist. So it's very much about allowing for a trusting relationship to develop, about creating a safe space, first of all, that the client feels so safe in that they can develop trust and share about their biography. And in that sense, I would say art helps to express things that might not easily be accessible verbally, or it's hard for people to talk about for various reasons, really. Like when we speak about trauma a little bit later, we'll come across that phenomena that sometimes it's hard to like put things in words, but there is images in our heads, and then art is a way to express that. Also for children, in my experience, it's generally easier to express themselves symbolically through play and art and images rather than talking about things in a way that we do as adults, really. And in that sense, the art making process itself can obviously also be soothing and grounding and have its own quality, but the expression and communication comes in as well, and the relationship with a therapist that's there as well when the art has been made.
I think, Carol, I'll add maybe a moment. I think the goals of art therapy are as varied as the approaches, because around the world, different art therapists sort of assume or are further trained. I know in Israel, a lot of art therapists also take further psychotherapy training and define their orientation in the mix between the two. And one of the important things to emphasize is that, I don't know if all art therapists would agree with this, but the general known way of dividing approaches in art therapy is between art as psychotherapy and art as therapy. So whether you're using the art for the specific goal of psychotherapy, if it could be based on attachment approaches, it could be CBT, it could be any kind of approach depending on the therapist and their training, or in our what I studied, and Gwen and Carol and a lot of our therapists study, is non-directive. So it's very often psychodynamic influenced, so to speak. Art as therapy tends to emphasize that even without talking, the act of art itself is therapeutic. And that's a place where sometimes you could look at an art therapy session, especially if it's an open studio or if it's an larger group activity, and say, well, what's the difference between this and art teaching or anything else? And the difference is the goal, in a sense, or the approach the art therapist comes with, because like Carol says, it's not about aesthetics, it's not about the final product, it's about the process and what the person is feeling throughout the process and what they're discovering through the process. But like I said, it varies greatly. So.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
That already leads to that sheet I have on here, because we were thinking when writing this that depending on the specific needs of a situation, art therapists can also work in a variety of different clinical or psychosocial settings. So when I'm describing the relationship, obviously the clinical setting is on my mind. And in that way, we can work individually with clients if it's possible. We can work in small, close groups, or as Nehama said, in open art studios. And in that sense, we try as much as other psychotherapy approaches to provide that continuity, to try to meet, in the same space at the same time on a weekly basis, to generate that feeling of predictability and safety within that, like to have the boundaries in place. On the other hand, like a lot of the time, especially when it comes to work with displaced populations, that long-term work is not really possible, and then it can be important to just deliver the content within short workshops or psychosocial art projects. And I'll just show you a few examples just now. One thing I just wanted to add is that because we have the artwork in the room, we think of a safe space not only for the clients but also for the artwork, because valuing the artwork is something very important, is also a huge part of the process. So what you usually have is that, if possible at all, you have folders for the artwork, that the paintings or pictures that are being made are stored in safely, and that the client can then later take home with them. So it's, in that sense, it's quite symbolic also what happens to the artwork, that it's well taken care of. And if that's not possible, at least we try to really talk about it, what's going to happen to the art after this workshop, who wants to take it home, so that we really make sure that we value it as something that's been made. And so this is a quite, I would say, famous picture for therapists, the triangular relationship. Speaking about it also with regards to the psychodynamic work that we do, to the transference that we see in the room, what you usually do have is a relationship between the client and the therapist, and you assume that there's certain unconscious material, emotions, thoughts, but also conscious and verbal thoughts and communication being exchanged. But then when the artwork comes in, we see it as a triangular relationship, because the client, when they make art, they might also put unconscious material into the image, for example, that they are making, or the sculpture or whatever. There might be conscious elements in it, there might be unconscious elements in it, and they see it in a certain way. And the same thing can happen to the therapist. So the therapist probably cannot just interpret a client's artwork just in relation to the client. If they want to interpret it at all, they would probably need to speak to the client, because what we see in the artwork, we assume, also has to do with our unconscious and biography, and how we relate to certain colors or whatever we see. So we do assume that there is transferences happening between all three elements there in the room. And just to make this a little bit more, to illustrate this a little bit better, we wanted to show you like different settings that we worked in. So this is what a room could look like if it's set up for small group or individual art therapy sessions, more in a closed space. In England, actually, a lot of art therapists work in schools. And since it's not always possible to have your own room and set up your own room without materials in a school, a lot of art therapists actually work with portable studios, so to speak, which you can see here. So they can go around between different schools and potentially even use classrooms after school is finished, obviously, with the children, and have all the materials there. Then this is a picture of a workshop that we did in Nepal, and that was after the earthquakes. And I was actually just thinking when I saw that today, today it's quite the opposite. During the Corona times, we were supposed to stay inside, but back then, like it wasn't safe to be inside because another earthquake might take place. So we had to set up outside. And like in that regard, you can also see that even just having a blanket, like marking the territory on the ground somehow can provide a space for a setting. And this is a picture from a tape art workshop in a refugee camp, which was obviously an art project, and it allowed the children to own their space a bit more, since this is quite transitory spaces and it might be quite hard to feel at home there. It can change when you can decorate them yourself in creative ways, and you can leave a mark in a place that you know you will leave soon. And the last example that we brought is just a creative activity in a welcome class, which is where most of the children with asylum-seeking or refugee backgrounds would go first of all, and before they would start regular classes in mainstream schools. And they're also an environment, as we say, much more in a psychosocial way, can be facilitated, that feels safe and valued. And if you don't have questions anymore about this part of the presentation, I would hand over to Nehama, who would talk about art, cultures, and diversity.
Okay, so I'm gonna go over this part cautiously because I can't be an expert in all arts, cultures, and so it's our humble. Put it this way, I'd like to pose some of these as more questions than necessarily answers, which is part, I think, of my approach. I realized at the beginning I didn't really mention much in terms of my professional background because we talked about my personal background. So I've also been working in Berlin since I came. A few months after I came, I worked with, I did art groups with immigrant children in Neukölln, and I've worked in the eastern part of Berlin in Marzahn-Hellersdorf with a variety of populations, including the Willkommensklasse, like you saw the image before. And I've been working in shelters and in schools with refugee children and with parents. So just so you get an orientation. And when it comes to art and cultures and diversity, come in the aspects of, I think, humbleness also, because as much as art therapy has fascinating theories, art has existed in different cultures throughout millennia, throughout time. So it's nothing new, so to speak. But not only is art nothing new, the healing aspects of art are not new to us. There are many theorists and art therapists that talk about these connections, about how we sort of go back and forth between learning what is useful, what works in art therapy and what works in therapy, and realizing at times in a humble way to what extent that is actually an element of different, not only artistic, ritualistic aspects of different cultures. So it's rooted in every culture, and especially in times of transition and upheaval, of course, it is even more present. It's universal. It makes it even. It's not only a matter of transcending language and cultural barriers. It's also a universal way of communication. It is in the sort of the basis. If you think of cavemen painting in caves, it's the basis of a lot of communication in humanity, the symbolism and the sensory motor aspect of the arts. Yeah, it could, like we were talking before about safe spaces, it creates a safe space to focus on the nonverbal and to focus on something other than only me, and to see it from the outside. And I think very importantly also for the communities that we work with, it's also an essential part of community. And we know that when we talk about understanding other cultures and understanding therapy in other cultures, then well, a lot of refugees we're working with right now in Germany come from a culture that has a very strong aspect of the communal and community. And I feel that I speak here, I can dab into myself a little bit, and I'll talk about it in a moment, but I also feel like I come from a community that has a very strong sense of it's not just I, it's us. And there's a very long and ongoing dialogue between how much am I focused on I and what's happening inside, and how much is it also relevant to us. And yeah, so like I said, raising questions. So I hope this will also be a source for discussion when we open up the discussion. But the question of what is creativity in its essence is a complex one. It's not a very simple one. Creativity is not, or one tends, I think in school, working in schools, one tends to associate creativity with taking a piece of paper and drawing. But creativity, of course, especially for someone with a background of music, or creativity can be any form of arts or not arts at all. You can be creative with math. It's about being able to be flexible with your mind and to think metaphorically and to communicate symbolically. And when we're working with different cultures from different backgrounds, there's also the question of which art feels familiar. We in the West, I would definitely, part of my own biography is that I did my first degree in Italy, in Florence. So I'm very much based in I learned a lot about the classical history of art in Europe. We may see art in a certain way. There might be a certain Western way of seeing, especially contemporary art, as it is valued as a personal expression of one specific person, and we think of the monetary value and the cultural value and the historical value, and we think of art in museums and galleries, but that's not necessarily true for any culture or within our culture, not necessarily for each person. Art or creativity means the same thing. So I find crafts and arts and ritual to be very, very important in this discussion, and they come up very much within the art, especially when I work with parents and children. I bring them forth, and in my own life, I also create. I also do a sense of craft. I studied calligraphy, and I create Jewish wedding certificates. I'll show them. You can show them later. You could go back and I'll show them later. It's okay.
All right.
Just to mention that
Okay.
my connection to craft. So I'm always, dialoguing in my own life between what is fine art and high art and craft, and what element of it is relevant to community, and what element of it, to what extent is it important that it's valued in a monetary or aesthetic sense. These are questions and dialogues that I myself have, especially when I'm constantly dealing with working with other people with art and working with myself with art. And maybe I'll emphasize to that art is something that belongs to everyone. I don't remember the quote. There was a good quote in Christian's book about art belonging to everyone. So in a sense, when we talk about sharing our tools, I don't think that it's exclusively for art therapists to use art. But I do believe, or a lot of art therapists believe within their practice, that it's very important to experience your own art. So not from the theoretical knowing, but also from doing. It creates a different kind of knowing also when you see another person creating art. You can have maybe a bit more of a feeling of what they're feeling, also in a sensory sense. You can move slides now. I'll give a little explanation. So I like to combine. I do individual work and small group work, but especially in my work in shelters, I found that it's very important that I've thought a lot about how do I bring the parents, get the parents to be more involved, and how do I sort of bridge the issues of needing to have a translator around all the time. So this is not, the workshops that I've done are not instead of individual work and work with parents, and dyadic work also with parents and children, which is a fascinating topic in and of itself, doing art. It adds another corner to the three. There's also a parent in there. This is an image from an art workshop with parents and children, something I've been occupied with for the past few years, where I wanted to bring some elements, some materials that would connect, perhaps. It was a hypothesis of mine. It wasn't that I necessarily knew what exactly they would connect to, but I brought all kinds of different materials that definitely connected to my own practice of art, and also to what might interest them. So I brought wood and gold leaf. I brought some real gold leaf that I often work with and is used especially in religious practices. It's historically has been used to decorate Qurans and Bibles and various religious works of art, but not only. So, and I brought prints, calligraphic prints of words with their translation in 4 languages. So it was Arabic, Farsi, German, and English. And this is a child that chose to take her own native Farsi and put the same word in Farsi and in German. And it's sort of just a small activity, but it definitely, you could see in her reaction that it definitely created this connection for her of being proud. This is my language, and you brought my language, and this is also my language. And, you know, I can put it together and create this beautiful thing that I can hang on my wall afterwards, which is another aspect of craft, of course, the element of it being something you can use, so to speak. So this is, just to be clear, this is not classic art therapy. This is not part of an individual process. This is an open workshop. But yes, a part of communicating, of getting community together, and of finding a way through culture and arts, or to have a cultural dialogue through the arts. You can move slides. So this is an example of something I find interesting, because, like I said, I think that not only do we expect those we work with to experience, to enjoy their experiences with art, to explore. This is working with adults, some of them facilitators, the idea of using arts for ourselves to reflect. So here I brought different words in different languages, and rather than immediately translating them, we interpreted the symbolism of what we saw through the symbolism. So it was an interesting experience. What you see in the image, if I'm not mistaken, the word in Arabic in the front is life, but you can only see part of it. It's not complete. I hope I'm not mistaken. And in the back, you see a word in Hebrew, which is light. And I think, I don't remember, it's from one of the famous Bibles from the middle 15th century. I don't remember exactly, but it was interesting, bringing different elements and parts of works of art. I should definitely give some credit to, I've worked through different projects over the years. I worked for a project called Cities of Peace. I specifically worked on a project in Armenia that was focused on commemorating 100 years to the Armenian Holocaust. And the concept of cities of peace, led by an artist called Ellen Frank, is also this idea of, on a more communal, larger level, creating monumental pieces where the focus is to learn about different cultural aspects of the arts and historical aspects of the arts, and to remember these aspects in cities that have endured trauma. So it's, again, this sort of play that I've had a lot in my life between classic art therapists purely working on a small scale. Small would be the wrong way to say it, because of course every person can be a huge world in and of himself, but working individually and in small groups, as well as on a larger community sort of focus. So you can put the last one, then I'll I'll say a word or two about this is my own art, but which I usually don't bring up when I talk about art therapy. But since we're talking about these sort of cultural aspects, so this is what I do as well, which is Jewish wedding certificates. And I can't give you the connection to trauma, although it is a way, and it's very interesting to think about it, to connect to your own biography, in a sense. In Judaism, the wedding certificate is something that has been traditionally used, and there's a reason why it's been used to be illustrated, because there weren't a lot of other venues to do so, for various reasons and religious aspects. And a lot of symbolism goes into these works traditionally. So the symbolism, again, connects to this idea of it's not only my history and my trauma, but it's also the communal history and what we make of it and what the symbols that we take out of it. So yeah, the sentence here is from I think it's Song of Songs in English. I found my beloved, but so it's not, this specific sentence isn't about trauma, but later on in the discussion I can definitely bring up some ideas of where trauma comes into it as well. So Carol, do you want me to continue, or do you want to? Oh, right. This one.
Should we show the video quickly? You want to say a word about
just explain? This is the last bit about culture and the arts. So I should mention, I am very much fine arts focused. That's my background. And that's another aspect of art therapy that is important to know, is that there are different modalities. As well as art therapy, there's movement therapy, movement dance, drama therapy. So while we do train in a classic sense to focus only on our art form, there are also approaches to art therapy that focus on expressive arts therapy, so on all the art forms together. And I'm saying this right now because I think this aspect, which very much I dab in it a little bit. I like to, especially working interdisciplinary, to connect modalities together. So connect dance and rhythm to art, or drama, or anything like that. And I worked in collaboration with professionals who have different backgrounds. And I think that need connects a lot to rituals that you can find around the world that express exactly that. So this specifically is a ceremony that was on the news in Australia. My dad was born in Australia, so there's the connection there. Just now in January, before the pandemic came out, there were the horrible fires in Australia, and there was a ceremony in an Aboriginal ceremony in Australia, and some actually a friend of mine, a few movement therapists, so colleagues of ours, went to support, or they were involved in this healing circle. But I think it's a good example of some cultural humility also, a moment where you can take a step back and say, okay, you know, I have my scientific knowledge and my training, but this ancient ritual is has value, and I want to listen and hear to what these people say about healing. So it's healing about because of the fires. So yeah, you can put it on.
I'm probably not going to let it go
No,
for the 3.5, but
no.
yeah.
We're at the foot of that mother mountain, Gulaka. We gathered here for a big bunan, what we call a corroboree. And it's one of the first biggest dances we held here on country for over 150 years. Today was about healing land, healing country, healing spirit, and healing people.
As soon as this call out happens, if you know who you are, we understand our identity, there is no question but to answer that call and come out here and stomp for our mother. And it's just basically following suit of all our teachers, all our knowledge holders, and looking after our old people and ancestors. Tradition has never been lost, the protocols have never been lost, the law is all the same, and it still exists within the land.
When I dance, I feel my old people and I listen to the beats and mother's heartbeat. And yeah, it just brings healing to me and strengthens me. And I know if I'm feeling that, then everyone there with us is feeling the same. For me, dance is just, it's like you're just free, you're just out there, you're just free. You're feeling the dirt, you're feeling the earth, you're just loving it. You're just dancing on your mother's country.
Carol, I'll let you decide when to stop, or maybe it's enough.
I was actually thinking.
Yeah.
If this video is being shared, we can also put the link for this video, you know, in there somehow, so people can watch the, and see and you know, look
That's
at it.
very interesting, I think.
Yeah. So should I continue, Carol, or do you want to?
I can do the start and then I'll hand it back.
We'll go back and forth. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe the couple of words about the video also from my side, which I really liked, is because I really often felt like whenever I come to a country that is not Western, you know, and I just bring my mental health perspective, you know, from my Western background, I'm wondering, like, how much is it helping? How familiar does it really feel for people? And that was also a discussion that we had a lot with the psychology students in Nepal, who were actually also trained, you know, according to Western thinking about mental health in their psychology MAs. And for me personally, what I've seen is like what Nehama also said, like creativity, especially in rituals and in everyday life, in crafts, is more familiar to people when it's from their own background and can maybe link up, you know, some of our ideas about healing. And yeah, the third part of the presentation that we wanted to speak about a little bit more is like how creativity relates to trauma and displacement, or like how creative methods can, you know, can help and work with trauma and displacement. We first of all chose a small statement from an art therapist who wrote or edited a book called Art Therapy and Political Violence, who was very much into that topic, and who said that arts and art therapy have a distinctive role to play in work with trauma because of their access to non-verbal material, which I really liked because, so I can see myself now, but like just before, when preparing for the presentation, I pulled out this book again, The Body Keeps the Score from Bessel van der Kolk, and I find it interesting how he speaks about the speechless horror, for example, you know, these experiences that like they come to us in flashbacks and nightmares, but we don't have words for them. And this is something, for example, you know, that art has an access to because it's visual rather than non-verbal. And then sometimes I've experienced in my work with clients, when the artwork is out there, the image is somehow out there, you know, it doesn't really matter whether it's exactly like it's in the head, but it's somehow out there, that then both the client and the therapist can look at it together and talk about it. Talking becomes a little bit easier because you don't try to speak about something in your head. You speak about just this little contained piece of paper in front of you. And yeah, so he also said before that making art judgmental, safe, accepting environment is key. Also because trust is often when it comes to trauma. So creating a safe space where, you know, you and your art, like whatever you're making, is not judged in any way, especially not according to aesthetics, but it's accepted, can be quite important. And when speaking about like refugees or asylum seekers, you know, more and more I like to speak about intersectionality as well, because especially people from Germany here will know the word Flüchtling, or yeah, I think most of us here, and it's become quite a thing in the media to use that word, and it's often quite labeling for people because you know, since it's been repeated in the news so many times, it's hard to even think about just the people behind that label, behind the definition. And I really liked what Nisa Sachnani, who is a drama therapist from the US, said about like refugees not being a monolithic group, but obviously there are also people with individual backgrounds, caregivers, adolescents, elderly, skilled professionals, very educated people, but also people with differing abilities, people with different gender identities or sexual orientations or different social status. And to hold all of that in mind, that you're not just working with, you know, one person that is like, that belongs to a group that's displaced, that has experienced trauma, and therefore you work with them in a certain way, you know, is, I think, very important, because people do come with their individual biographies and ideas and situations.
Yeah, Carol, I think also importantly, in that sense about intersectionality, it's important to remember that these are people who are experiencing difficulties and also, you know, are treated in an unequal way, not only because of being refugees, at times also because of being a woman, or because of being poor, or mental health, because of having a mental health diagnosis, whatever it is. And that's, in a sense, very important to remember that those difficulties are also there.
Yeah, definitely. So there's multiple layers of, you know, discrimination can take place, or other issues. I was hoping to speak about that, but it's true, it belongs more to intersectionality. I was hoping to speak about that a little bit more on another sheet.
Okay.
It's just really to, I mean, look very briefly at how complex situations can be. And in that sense, we also wanted to look at trauma as something that can be quite complex, because when we prepared and we were speaking about trauma, actually, Nehama and I, we both said, like, mostly we work with people who have complex trauma, who haven't just experienced one incident. And complex PTSD as such has recently been, you know, acknowledged in the mental health world. And what you say is that, you know, the symptoms are similar to PTSD that can, you know, also occur after just individual experiences, but still adults might, on top of that, have lost a lot of trust in other people if they experience a lot of violence repeatedly in their lives, and they might feel separated. And here again, we have, a double jeopardy, a multiple, an issue that on many levels, because people might feel separated from others because of complex PTSD, but especially people who are displaced might already feel separated from others because they're not in their familiar cultural background, and then they might look different from others, and they have different abilities from others. They don't speak the same language. So there again, we have the issue of the many layers that people struggle with. And and on top of that come feelings of shame or guilt, of difficulty controlling emotions if you experience these things over a long period of time, physical symptoms that are impacting you, and a lot of relationship difficulties and destructive and risky behavior such as self-harm is often spoken about when it comes to complex PTSD. So something that people in Germany spoke a lot about is sequential traumatization that I just wanted to bring up within that space as well, because I found it quite interesting. Carlson has actually done research with children who survived the Holocaust and were orphaned, and people translated it to the current situation for refugees who, in the first sequence, often experienced like war or violence or whatever, like deprivation, something that occurred in their place of residence. And then in the second sequence, they experience their actual flight, when they're trying to travel to flee from that situation. We all know the pictures in the Mediterranean, but there's also been other difficulties for other people along the way. But then the third sequence is really, in our case here in Germany, or in the host country, where there's so many difficulties in the social environment that we just spoke about. So in that sense, to look at traumatization as a process rather than just individual events is something that I found very important for my work repeatedly, really. And this is where I wanted to speak a little bit more about the multiple layers of injustice that people might face, and how trauma, we know, is something as something that has to do a lot with power dynamics, especially when it's officially called man-made disaster, but when violence is involved, when you have felt extremely helpless, when another person has been cruel to you or has violated you and your boundaries in many ways, emotionally, physically. And actually, it's estimated that 70% of all traumatized refugee populations have experienced or witnessed violence. So it's quite a big topic. And having that like on top of a lot of other experiences like systemic racism, gender equality, also just, discrimination or disadvantages when you come to a place and you don't speak the language, and you really have to find your way through, and you have to fit into a system that you really don't know, and that sometimes might not make it easy for you to thrive. And I probably am like not mentioning 100 different things, then power dynamics really do play a role, and they do also play a role in the therapy room, because we do like to think that we are, that we see people on an eye level, but I think it's really hardly possible when there's a person who's sharing their biography. Well, we aren't sharing ours, and we are putting up the boundaries, which is part of our job, but then still we say we meet at a certain time, we say how long we meet, and all of that stuff. And we also come in many instances with that, an obvious higher education in psychotherapy. and a knowledge of the system of the country that we're in. And by the way, this is an artwork that I once upon a time made when I was experiencing power dynamics, and it was my kind of way of expressing how I was feeling. So that's why I like to put it up as something where I used art to process something. I'm just gonna say this, and maybe we can already join forces here, Nehama, if you want. I just wanted to have a little bit of a summary while speaking about trauma in what way art can be used in that context. Another thing that I saw in the Body Keeps the Score book is that he really recommends that people are firmly grounded in the present moment when they're trying to speak about whatever difficulties they have experienced. And I have experienced in my sessions with clients that when you stimulate your senses, which you do during art making, you use your hands, while you're expressing something very difficult, that can already feel soothing and grounding in the process and keep you in the present moment. It's not always the case, but I've found it quite helpful. And then, as I think I mentioned that already, that a lot of the times, especially children, find it easier to process feelings visually and symbolically. So they rather talk about monsters are coming, or, there's like, I had sword fights in the therapy room, or someone needed to be saved. But it's more been symbols and images rather than really talking about something verbally. And that can obviously also be true for adults who really don't have the words for what they experienced. And something else that I've often actually experienced is that, there's difficulties with trust in the relationship. As said, that is often the case with complex PTSD, and it might also be justified that, there is just not a trusting relationship from the start. But then often direct contact, like sitting across from each other, like face to face, like looking each other into the eyes, that can be difficult too. And then to have a joint attention, like look at an object together, can already relieve a bit of the tension in the room. And there can also be silence in the room while a client is working, or, different clients in a group are working, without it being like too tense or uncomfortable. So I found that quite remarkable how helpful that can be. And then, as we said before, like making art in a way that you're using it in a way to create a space when you don't have a home, making it your space because you're creating something there and leaving a mark, showing others you're there, like you have been there if you have to move on, can feel quite empowering and encouraging. And then, yeah, as I said, it can be playful, which makes it more age appropriate for children of some ages, and supports their well-being also on a psychosocial level, like taps into their resources. And Nehama, is there something, or also Gwen, that you want to?
Yeah, I actually, speaking of Van der Kolk, I don't know if I can quote him well, but he talks about the healthy essence within a person, that even a very traumatized person, there's sort of a healthy, secure, what was he saying, being that wants to come out. I'm not quoting him correctly, but it's very interesting when you think about it from the aspect of art. So basically, Van der Kolk, the way I understand him is, once a person is grounded and stabilized and given a safe environment and safe relationship, then eventually, we have a resilience within ourselves, and given the right environment and the right relationship and the right process, our goal is to bring that little core out, the core of the resilient part. And I think it's very interesting when you think about it from the perspective of art. there are a lot of art therapists and a lot of theorists that talk about developmental stages in art and learning how to create and learning art, similar to akin to developmental stages of children when they grow, their cognitive developmental stages, for example. And a lot of art therapists working with trauma-informed art therapy focus on understanding what developmental stage the child needs. So if the child is repeating something, if he's doing something repetitive and doing the same, as I had sand in, there was a art room that I was using for 2 years, and I had kinetic sand in there. And there were some certain children who were drawn to create over and over again in sand, even if they were older than what you would expect them to be, sort of, you expect a 3-year-old to play in a certain way in sand, in a more sensory way, touching, rather than creating a specific symbol. And it's interesting also to connect that to both children and adults, because we like to think that it's only opening up for children, that with children it's easier to see and to say, okay, then maybe that child didn't experience a safe environment in which to explore this important developmental stage of just feeling safe, exploring in a sensory way. But it's the same with adults, especially adults who have experienced complex PTSD. I've worked with adults in a psychiatric ward in Jerusalem with complex PTSD, and I've experienced processes very similar with adults, where they said, yeah, actually, I've never worked with finger paints, for example, because I missed my childhood. I had all these things that happened, all these traumatic events in my childhood. And actually, what I want is to re-experience that, is to re-experience fun. And in that sense, fun is not sort of, to me, a superficial thing, but rather a really, really essential stage that they need to go through to come back to be this full person who feels safe to discuss their biography, things they've experienced. And one more thing about joint attention, because I mentioned before dyadic art, working with parents and children. So when I work with children, especially with any children, and definitely refugee children as well, I find parent work to be very essential, because we like to think we can go through a process and be the person who makes the big change in the child's life, but the people who are all the time with the children are the parents. Of course, parents who are traumatized need to go through their own process. If I'm working with their child, I'm not going to be their therapist, but sometimes having joint attention between the parent and the child and the therapist can also create a bit of a safer place to experience something together outside of the more intimidating world of, everybody else is expecting things of me and thinking about whether we're going to get a permit and et cetera, but just sitting quietly in a room and creating together with the child is an experience that for the parent and the child can be very significant, especially when you're talking about stages that the child needs to experience.
Nehama, I think the next picture is no, it's
right. Okay.
One. Okay.
Okay. I think we should we want to leave time for questions, right? And I realized that we've been speaking for quite a while, right? So I'm just gonna I assume that most of the people here are therapists themselves, or people in the field, so you all know the Maslow hierarchy of needs. I wanted to. And I'm assuming that quite a lot have already spoken about this aspect, that often people who are in a situation of so much uncertainty really need, first of all, their physiological needs and their safety, and need to have their basic needs met before they, feel stable or are stabilized enough to go through sort of deeper work about their trauma. And Maslow puts creativity high up there, and self-actualization. And I like to question that. I wonder to what extent, after all this discussion about what is creativity and what is art and where is it placed, I see that as a bit of a Western way of seeing it, that creativity is only self-actualization, rather than it also being an essential part of community and of creating a home. So it's a question, and we can go back to it. Yeah, and this, I was searching and searching for quotes by Maslow to see if he contradicts himself. I'm not sure that this is him contradicting himself exactly, but I think it's a very nice quote, very interesting what he says, that self-actualization, creativeness is emitted like in a radioactive way, just like cheerfulness and sunshine, and spreads all over the place, and makes some things grow if they're growable, and is wasted in rocks and ungrowable things, which is just the last part of that sentence. We can have an hour discussion just about that. I think it's fascinating. Right, so we've come to the end of our presentation. We brought some examples of also the empowering aspect, and what both me and Caro, when we discussed it, find is very important for, especially when we're talking about children and working creatively with children who have experienced trauma, that they have the choice what they want to present to the world and how they will present it, but they also can be proud of showing something about themselves. Here is a work that I did in a group, where each child made a part of the puzzle of the tree, and they had some magazines that they cut pictures out of to, it's going to get us close actually to talking about narrative, because I asked them what they love and what they want to tell about themselves, and so they put different images. You can really see, I've done this cute little tree thing a few times, and it's always very interesting to see, because it really emphasizes right in front of your eyes how different each child is, and their personality really shines out of it, because you've got the same image and similar colors, and no matter what you do, it's always going to come out very, very different between the different sides. And you can put them together, and you have this sense of community is together with a sense of individual exploration. Carol?
Yeah, I just gonna say a couple of sentences, which is really enough. I think this is one of the images that were made in the project that we spoke about during the last presentation with Homines, the Mahmoud project of Save the Children. I found this so interesting because we did we used the photo voice method with the girls, and something that came up very, very often was the pictures on the wall, like paintings on the wall that were made by their friends, by other people who lived in that specific shelter. And it really struck me how important it was for them. But I was thinking it's their way, possibly their only way at that moment in time, to create their environment, to really show something of them and really have something, that they can contribute in, like what the place looks like. And in the middle, it's not very big, but you see this this little flag that was painted on a door, actually, or drawn on a door. And the girl was massively proud of it, because it, it spoke about Albania and what it meant. And so they created a symbol there that was relating back to their culture, which seemed really important. So yeah, we just wanted to show the small examples that we brought. But I would say at this point that I can also go back to the presentation if needed, if you have questions about a specific image or something like that. But otherwise, I would say I just stop sharing the screen, and we go back to the discussion with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
funny. I see your screen. Okay, that's it was like shuffle. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this great presentation. I think that was quite comprehensive. It showed a lot of aspects that are important to your work and our work. It showed this. It gave us an introduction to art therapy in general. It was a nice link to trauma theory and trauma therapy. And in the end, you showed us examples from the practice, from the practical work. I really enjoyed it, found it very interesting. And I'm wondering if there are questions of...
Or Gwen, maybe you want to say something from your side? Did we miss anything?
It's not really a question, but it's not a very well crafted thought either. But I just wanted to acknowledge something about the healing circle and the ritual that you spoke about, and how it seems very much connected with feeling, and that as being very different to the Western way of thinking and learning. So that's something about the thinking and the feeling coming together in art therapy, I suppose. So I'm kind of thinking of art as being very playful and really where lots of emotion and feeling kind of emerge, and then that can be kind of combined with the verbalizing and the processing and the kind of turning that into thought that might become kind of useful moving forward.
Yeah. Specifically, Aborigines are so interesting because growing up, I spent a lot of time in Australia. That's where my grandparents lived. That's where they were refugees. They escaped to Australia. And growing up, I used to see a lot of Aboriginal art. I loved Aboriginal art. And it took me a long time to realize that seeing it in a museum is a very different way from what it was meant to be, and that actually it's a form of art that is not necessarily meant to stay, circles and sand, and it's not necessarily meant to endure time. So it's very interesting because I think it's a good analogy for some art therapists, what they experience in art therapy. It doesn't necessarily have to be shown. It's not all about the aesthetics and how it will eventually look from a Western point of view of what aesthetics are.
Absolutely, and it's really about the process, and I guess that healing circle is about the process of coming together and how very meaningful that is for them. Very different to kind of something very static in a museum that is preserved and valued over time. It's kind of something ephemeral can be just as important or more important.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen.
Are there any other questions?
Could I ask a question?
Contributions?
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
cool. I wanted to just share one thing and also ask a question, like regarding the Maslow hierarchy of needs. There's a really interesting critique of that by a liberation psychologist, a Spanish liberation psychologist who worked in El Salvador, named Martín Baró. And I thought that was really cool that you brought that up, because I don't hear that very often, that people critique this kind of idea that's so embedded in our heads. But I thought it was this wonderful, this radical notion of that people who are kind of living in very precarious situations would also have a right to kind of explore these other areas that are normally reserved for people who don't, or who have more of the basic needs. But like, I thought that was really wonderful and radical. But it's his name is I can maybe type it because it's
do so.
I will.
Please, I'd love to.
And then another my question is really specific. I sometimes, and it's just about like use of art therapy or something kind of other than words by untrained professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I don't have any background in art therapy at all, but I have a huge respect for it. And sometimes I have the kind of instinct to use clay, like for clients who use their fidget with their hands a lot and have a lot of like emotion that they have a hard time expressing, or anxiety, to kind of give them clay to use, just so that they can feel their hands going into something, or I don't know, it's just sort of an idea. And I don't know if you would have any kind of ideas about whether that would possibly be like something that I would need to know how to contain, that I would actually need to know what, like, have some kind of theory behind in order to use that in a session with somebody? Or do you think it's kind of sort of accessible more widely to people without specific training?
It's interesting that you bring up clay, because my master's thesis was about clay. So
oh my gosh,
I focused on clay, and I've published about it. So I could definitely send an article about it, about working with fathers with clay.
Oh, cool.
My supervisor, my professor, wrote about mothers and working with clay. I think, like I said, I think art, anyone can use it. I'm not against people who are not art therapists using art in their, I mean, I'm not sure if the other two art therapists agree with me. That's my perspective at this time. But when it comes to clay, and there's been research about it, clay has two aspects to it. It's got an aspect that is very calming and soothing, and it's got an aspect that can be very overwhelming and messy, and it's sort of one of these materials that can also very quickly bring out a certain feeling, can be connected to the history of the client. And so what I can say that I do is, that's why I've had also kinetic sand, which is not less messy. It's got its own aspect. But I have a few different options of sort of 3D material or tactile material that you could use. And it's really a matter of assessing. And of course, if you're an art therapist, then you have a better feel to it, because that's the point. You have the experience and you know the materials. But if you know the client, you can sort of have a feeling of what might suit them better. So specifically with children, sometimes modeling clay for children was better. It could be the same with adults. It's a really individual thing, but really different materials can bring out different aspects. And maybe I would try out something a little less messy first and see how they react to it.
Interesting. So good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I would add that, well, we all work non-directively, which is also different from a more directive approach, more behavioral approach. But I do like to be non-directive when it comes to a variety of materials, exactly for that reason. Because from my experience, when things don't feel safe yet, then children, but also adults, they tend to use a material that they can control, like a pencil, and a ruler. I've seen that, and you're very exacted. You can stay with the lines and have it under control, and it kind of feels relatively safe. And then sometimes it takes quite a while to get to that more massive regressive state where you can explore, merge things, but it often doesn't feel safe at first. So I think this is more what I would keep in mind. But otherwise, I think if therapists generally can help people to tap into their creative resources, I would also think it's positive, really.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gwen, you want
Can I also ask?
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering if you also, I mean, of course, you probably did work with much elderly people. And how was that different from the rest of your experience, especially working with children? Does does it also work for them, you think?
Yes, in my experience, it did. I would say the main difference that I saw in my work, I really have to add, is mostly with people who are traumatized in some ways. So that might be different than other issues that people face. But in my experience, children are quite flexible when it comes to creativity. Like it's easier for them to. It's almost like they still grow organically, and it's easier for them to use organic methods. You know, that have very much to do with movement and play and being there and expressing themselves. And for adults, in my experience, especially older people, there have been so many experiences already, you know, that relate to how you're allowed to express yourself, maybe also ideas what art should look like, how you can embarrass yourself, or maybe even just about how safe it is to do so, that it often takes a lot longer for them to start using material. But that is a generalization. So like the individual might have really good access and really love creativity. So yeah.
Nice. Thanks.
Yeah. Nehama, do you?
No, pretty much similar experiences to you. I have had more experience. I have been working more with children and younger adults than with the elderly. Yeah, sometimes it's just like I said about the developmental stages. Sometimes you find that they're different. I like in that sense to use different modalities. Sometimes if you feel like someone might feel more comfortable moving or whatever it is, writing a poem, whichever it is that works for them, and then to take it from there and develop it in a more creative direction, that might feel a little safer for adults. But once they're, like I've experienced that once they're tapped into this mode and they're finally drawing and they feel a little less inhibited, then they really go back to whichever stage it is that they left off, so to speak, and haven't explored enough.
Yeah, some people really get into it over time as well. So I would agree. Like once you get to that point where it's easy to make art, then it's usually a flow of different things that people try out.
Yeah, I just agree with what you both said about sort of how it can be even more important the older you get to reconnect with that playfulness, which we all lose sight of to some extent as life gets more serious. And yeah, being able to connect with the playfulness that you felt when you were a child is really important for people, and it can happen for people of all ages. But yeah, possibly the older you get, the harder it is to kind of have the courage to try new things that don't feel familiar anymore or seem difficult. And lots of people come with kind of ideas that they can't draw, kind of judgments that they've gained over the years from different places, and so it can be a bit more of a sort of a barrier to getting started sometimes.
Are there any other questions, remarks? Yeah, Mr. Kappes, please.
First, thank you very much for the presentation. I had in hospitals earlier, but it was always sort of a mystery to me what you did. It was successful in some way, but I couldn't really tell what they actually did down there in the cellar. The question I was did you experience decompensation when you worked with the kids sometimes? And if so, how did you manage to contain that?
What was the word? Decompensation?
Decompensation, that kids got too far into sort of a flashback or a situation which they reminded too actively. As far as I know, usually don't do the, how do you say that in English? Entspannungstrainings.
Relaxation.
Relaxation trainings in advance. How do you compensate these situations if they decompensate?
Carol, do you have
hand it over to me?
No, I can also, yeah.
I think we do a mixture. I think my work is very much about that, actually, you know, like mostly when children come to me, it's because they are referred, because, you know, people say they have behavioral issues, they can't control themselves, they were like, you know, unbearable in classrooms, whatever. And it's very much about working to contain these feelings, really. And I have found that art can be a container in some ways, because you redirect the feelings that you have. Like a lot of, especially when we talk about trauma, but obviously also because of other reasons, anger is a huge issue, you know. The children are often angry when they come. And to learn how to redirect that anger is actually a feeling that's really okay to have, and it's welcome in the therapy room. But you obviously, you know, the appropriate thing to do is maybe not to beat up your therapist, but to maybe beat up a piece of clay, you know, or tear a paper or splash color around. Like, you know, the best rooms are the ones that can get really messy and it's not a problem, you know, which is very rare, because often people, you know, use it afterwards, like other people use it. But to learn how to deal with these emotions together during art therapy is I think one of the biggest parts of the work. And then gradually the children, in my experience, learn themselves how to contain what it is that they bring that feels so uncontainable.
Yeah, I mean, similar to what Carol says, there are so many layers to it. I think it's very individual. Different cases would definitely, like, it really depends on the child's history and the child's specific reactions to, you know, it's so specific. But I think the setting for us, our therapist, setting has multiple meanings and symbolism and metaphor. It's sort of from day one, from the moment I meet a child, the room is a metaphor, the materials are a metaphor, it's all used all the time. And it actually sometimes makes it easy to discuss without getting into complicated detail what the boundaries are, because I could talk, because the child might not really, and I've had that definitely happen to me, where the child didn't really understand what I meant. It wasn't really connected to that they're hurting me in the way they're speaking, or hurting another child in the way they're acting, was very hard to cognitively explain. But when I take a tray and I say, look, this is the art room. It has specific rules, and you are most welcome to use this material that you love, but it's only going to happen inside the tray. That's my rule. So I'm telling them this, I can contain you, but I can only contain you in this space. This is my rule. Inside here, you can go wild. It becomes a nonverbal way of defining boundaries and setting and dialoguing, because it's constant dialogue. Can I use this material? Am I allowed to do it together? Can I do it on my own? And then it goes on and on through a process. And another aspect that I can say is, I had a specific case where I bring in some of the different arts that I've had in my life and that I've learned. And so I studied Hebrew calligraphy, but also I did some, I'm far from an expert, but I took a few classes in Chinese calligraphy, and I really like it. And both calligraphy, but Chinese even more than Hebrew, has an element of meditation to it. And added to the element of meditation to it, when you're connecting initially to a child, you have to find something that grabs them. It could be soccer, it could be video games, but in the arts, I look for what in the arts is exciting them. And maybe a lot of kids don't like drawing with pencils because it's what they do in class, and it reminds them of art class, and etc. So when a child says to me martial arts, or, you know, I have a husband who teaches martial arts, so I'm not far removed from that. Then I play along and I say, okay, interesting. You know that I studied Chinese. I bring myself. You know, maybe I could teach you a word in Chinese calligraphy, and I bring the ink. And I've had a child that was really behaviorally difficult. He found it very, very difficult to sort of self-regulate. but was so excited about the concept of Chinese calligraphy because he could make a word that would connect the martial arts he likes, that through that I taught him some breathing. You know, I told him, okay, it's not, if you want to do it, you want to manage to do it the way I just did it, you have to breathe and then breathe out when you put the brush with the ink on the paper. So there are lots of different ways to use it. And it could be, like Carol said, it could be less directive or more directive.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, the idea, the structure of our talk was also to bring in some contrast with what we are doing here at Homines. And during your talk, during your presentation, I was thinking, what are the commonalities between this art therapeutic approach and what are the differences? And I think we're just about to tap into working with children. And here I think this creative approach, I think, is perfect. I completely agree with it. And I guess that Rahel, who is the one who especially puts this into practice, would agree with me. Rahel, don't you? What do you think? Anyway, yeah.
I do agree with you.
Okay.
Not just because you are my boss.
Thank you. As far as the adults are concerned, I found two major commonalities and two differences, and I'd like just to point this out, and then we can see how it relates to each other. I think, let me start with the commonalities. The first one is this idea of empowerment. Well, first of all, the trauma work that we're mainly doing here is narrative exposure. Narrative exposure, like, I don't know if you're familiar with the testimony technique, which is that persons that are afflicted from political persecution just tell their story, and it seems to be a vital need for them to tell their story, and this does have a therapeutic effect. As was observed in the 1970s under the conditions of Chile, under the conditions of the military dictatorship. And this approach we have adopted. So that's what we're doing here mainly when it comes to trauma therapy in a narrow sense. Of course, there's much around it, but in the narrow sense, it's narrative exposure. And so I think there's two main commonalities with that to your work, which at first is the empowerment framework. I think that trauma very much, well, I think the core of a traumatic experience is the experience of powerlessness, isn't it? Or of disempowerment, if you see it in a process and in a societal framework. So I think when you deal constructively with trauma, it is an act of empowerment in itself. So, and I think this is an experience that you probably make when your clients are able to express their traumatic experience and at the same time become empowered through this expression. True?
Yes.
so that's and the same thing we observe when they tell their story. They feel relieved. They feel well, empowered, sometimes in a literal sense, through this telling their story. The second thing that is a commonality is, I think, the working with the body, the the sensual aspect of painting or drawing in your case. And we have developed a ritual, a body ritual, which closes each session of narrative exposure. And the idea behind it is just to, when the stress disturbs the person, when the stress excites them, and when they're re-traumatized in a way, in a therapeutic way, then we found that it's useful to put the stress down to the ground. So it is a top-down movement, which this body ritual tries to exert, and it proves that it is quite helpful. So probably this is quite a different use, in quotation mark, of the body than in your case, because it is a fixed ritual. It's really a ritual. It's not creative, but it works very well. Whereas in your case, it's well, the dancing or the using the pencil, the how do you say? You know what I mean? So there is a bit of difference here, but also commonality. And now let me come to the differences. First of all, I think the paradigm is a pretty different one, because your paradigm, I think, is to the creative paradigm, if I may say so, is to process the trauma or the traumatic memory and to transform it while somehow being playful with it. Whereas our approach is, we call it a psychological operation. It's like pulling out a bad tooth. It's a kind of surgical paradigm, which I think is pretty much a different story, but it works very well. So it's not creative in kind of, well, developing, transforming the trauma, but rather to pull it out of the organism, if you will. And this goes along with this difference that you very much emphasized in your presentation, which is the difference between verbal dealing with the trauma and a non-verbal dealing with it. So obviously, narrative exposure is an explicitly verbal access to the trauma. And well, one might wonder if then there is non-verbal material which is not appropriately addressed through this approach. Well, this is an open question, and I'd like to leave it with this open question. So it's these two commonalities and these two differences, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about this.
I think this is my perspective, but the way I see just the nonverbal verbal discussion is it's very interesting to me. I think it's Daniel Stern that talks about nonverbal communication in therapy, and I'm talking about in verbal therapy, that there's constant nonverbal communication, whether it's through the way you're sitting or swallowing or breathing or blinking. It's happening all the time. And so there's this, we ourselves, our therapists, present our therapy in this dichotomy between verbal, nonverbal, but actually there's a lot of verbal going on in our therapy in specific settings, and there's a lot of nonverbal going on without the art. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to think about that, because and I would also pose as an open question, to what extent is the verbal the representation of true reality or more cognitive reality, whereas the nonverbal is a representation of something sort of less, what's the word? Real. Real is not the right word, but I think to me, as a person who's always created, and sort of it's something that I feel is part of my language at times. I think we can be very creative with the way we use words and narratives, and I think that that they don't necessarily represent something that is more true to us than the way we're moving or what we're doing in symbolically in the art. So I think these plays between this one world, these differences are interesting to think about. I think there's a little bit of each in each world.
I think I would add to that and say, not even like, I think at least in the way I used to work, not even just a little bit, because I was actually when I started working with with refugee populations or displaced populations and people from different countries who didn't speak German or English, then what you do is work with an interpreter, normally, which kind of complicates the whole triangular relationship that I was speaking about, because there's more people. And then I realized very quickly I have to find a way to work here, because I do need verbal information, like we do need to speak about like, some experiences or some artwork. But the problem was that like most of the time when I tried, making art when there is an additional person, an interpreter in the room, became almost impossible. It's like too many people watching, what you're doing. And so I came up with like a structure when we would make art, like maybe for 3 sessions or 2 sessions, or depending on the situation. And then we would have a session with an interpreter and exchange verbally, because I realized, like, of course, if there's no way at all, art is a way to communicate still when you cannot use language, but it's not the ideal, I would say. So I prefer to really also speak about what the thoughts are behind an image, because again, what I might see in the image might really just be what I see, and it might have nothing to do. I might miss really like big clues about what's actually being communicated here. And something that actually we didn't really name as such was it struck me when you spoke about the testimonial therapy, is the part of witnessing. Because I think a huge part is that justice that you have experienced witness, and it's not like hidden somewhere, which is often the case within these power dynamics anyways. And that is something I think very essential as well, that art allows. It's because you see it, it's literally there, and there is something that you can share, that you can, that as many people as you will like are going to see.
And you can look back on a process also.
Exactly, yeah, that too. So people have created their own like little narrative structures through different images too. Yeah, but the witnessing is, I think, a really, really important part of that, especially the work that has to do with political violence.
I would add to that just that, as I mentioned, I like working cross-modality and interdisciplinary. I find it fascinating and very interesting to develop something together. I've worked in the past in co-facilitating groups together with people with different perspectives and different ways of working. And I'm currently, the work I do in the project I'm focused on now is an art therapy project in a school, and I do it together with a social worker who's trauma pedagogue. And so we we have tried with the children specifically. It's been hard to have a regular sort of body exercise or something that's really the same every time. But we do use other techniques together. And something that I found very fascinating and brings me back to narrative approaches is that I find working, as I said, when I'm working with parents, the first meeting is very important and hard to organize with translators and everything, but it is very important to hear from the parent to understand, and of course to agree to therapy, but to understand what is happening with their child and to describe. And often, because I work closely with an Arabic-speaking psychologist, and we have we've worked together a lot. We have a dynamics that is quite comfortable together. We've had experiences where parents come in, and actually we spend too long. We find it hard to stop the conversation because they feel suddenly relatively safe. They can speak in their language, and they're in a closed room in the school, and something about it feels like they want to express something they've never managed to. They haven't been able to tell the teacher, this is our life story. And then I come out of there with life stories because the parents really want to tell them. So that's very interesting.
Okay.
Silence.
Are there any other contributions? This is not the case. Well, I think it's almost 2 hours.
Yeah, it's been long.
Yeah, I think that's a due time, and like last time, I'm really glad to. Well, oh, there was a chat room. Okay.
Oh, okay. I would have to ask the therapist I work with. She works with me in my organization, so yeah, I can't say her name. I don't want to say her name online before asking. But later on, I can ask her.
What I will do is because I've seen there's things in the chat, so I'll also post the link to the video that we shared in the chat, just so that people have.
Oh yeah, that's great that you're doing this.
Yeah, okay. We're gonna have. Oh wow, how interesting. Okay, now I see everything. Yes.
Yeah, and that was a good hint. This link, because well, like our last talk, I'm really glad that we have recorded it, and we'll see what we're going to do with it, because the first half or the first third of the conversation, I think there were technical problems. It was, yeah. I don't, yes, there were. I don't know if when it's recorded, how it comes out. I just don't know. So we have to see what we do with it.
Okay.
And well, I very much liked the process of that. The idea for the next talk came during our last talk, Carolyn, if you remember.
Yeah.
So it's like a chain, and I like this chaining. I like this creating links, actually. And this reference to Australia and to the Australian Aboriginal people really means a lot to me. I've written something about it. It's really, I'm quite passionate and enthusiastic about it. So I was glad. I didn't know that your father is from Australia, and I was glad that you incorporated this ceremony, which I like very much. And the idea for the next talk that we're thinking about is indeed to ask an Aboriginal community in Queensland if they were prepared to share their fight against the Carmichael coal mine. Have you heard about it? The Carmichael coal mine is this infamous coal mine in the middle of Queensland, Eastern Australia. It's about, this Indian corporation Adani wants to build a coal mine there. One of the biggest, if it is realized, it's one of the biggest coal mines in the world, and obviously contributes much to climate change. So from an ecological point of view, it's really a disaster. And there is an Aboriginal community there, which since quite a few years, fights against this. They were pretty successful, but they're really offensive, asking for support, for international support. Maybe this could be a way to do this. And well, I was thinking about this idea of doing our next conversation about this and invite them. I think it would be important to have a psychosocial expertise here too. And I'm just wondering, it would be a possibility if you, Nehama, could, as a kind of bridge, between Australia and between Germany, between Israel and all of that, if maybe you could also participate. But that's just immature idea. I have not asked them yet. It's just an idea. But I think it's very important to support them with solidarity in their struggle against this catastrophic coal mine. And it would be a real, I think, a powerful act of empowerment for us all, actually. And this is where the empowerment comes in again.
Yeah.
And maybe also the art and the tradition. And the lady from the UK just mentioned this, if I got you right, the spiritual circles. You said something about this, didn't you? About a circle where the ceremony takes place. And indeed, they on the field of this coal mine, there is such a circle, such a traditional circle, and one of the spokespersons is not allowed to go there anymore. So there's also the spirituality, the dreaming, the art aspect of the dreaming, which I'm absolutely fascinated about. So this could be the next chain in our creating links.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I wish I remember, I'm probably going to quote this wrong, but I think my dad wrote something about there was in World War II, there was a group of Aborigines in Australia who protested. That there was a story like that they came in support of the Jews in Europe. And, yeah, it's very fascinating because, we think of ourselves as empowering, but there are other different times, different people, are advocating for others, which I guess we didn't get to talk much about the history of my family, so that can be a different time.
Yeah,
different conversation.
Different location, yeah. Okay, so are there further ideas, questions, comments by our participants? This is not the case. So I'd really like to thank you. I'm very grateful for this conversation. I'm glad we've recorded it again. I hope it was in a way rewarding for you too. I think I can speak of all of our participants that it was really informative and, as I've said before, kind of overall presentation about all the relevant aspects. And it's fantastic to have the opportunity to experience something like that instead of, always digging into books or whatever it is. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And
Thank you.
I think there will be a possibility when we somehow can pursue this. So all the best of you. Stay healthy. And see you next time. Okay.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.